Israeli strikes across Lebanon, particularly, of course, in the south where they are ongoing. What we have heard today in Beirut from the Israeli military is a new evacuation order for a broad area of southern Beirut. This includes areas that have not previously been under evacuation warning. So that has, of course, stoked concern around a possible expansion of the Israeli strikes here in the capital. And of course, this comes just a day after we saw that large-scale wave of airstrikes across the country. More than 100 targets, according to the Israeli military, who has said that they were targeting Hezbollah command and military targets. But of course, we were here on the ground in Beirut seeing those strikes firsthand, and the impact on the ground, which it has to be said were largely targeting civilian areas. We saw on the ground the aftermath of these strikes hitting civilian apartment buildings, residential buildings, local businesses in areas that were extremely populated and busy at the time. And of course, we've been getting updates from local officials and authorities here, the health ministry, saying that the death toll across Lebanon from yesterday's large-scale aerial assault is now over 300, with hundreds more wounded. And of course, the total death toll in Lebanon since the war began, so in just the space of just over a month, is now over 1,800, according to the health ministry. And many here in this country, many of those that we've been speaking to, have been calling for an immediate ceasefire, an end to hostilities. Many here want to see an immediate end to the war. And that is something that the Lebanese government has been pushing for weeks, of course. And it's important to underscore that while we are seeing the continuation of hostilities between Hezbollah, the Iran-backed group in the south, and of course the Israeli military, the Lebanese government itself has been calling for a diplomatic resolution to this latest conflict. In fact, the Lebanese president wrote to the United Nations outlawing Hezbollah's military wing. We know that the Prime Minister has most recently called for its security forces to rid the capital of all non-state arms. The hope for many, of course, is that push for diplomacy will achieve some sort of resolution. But hearing from the Israeli Prime Minister that Lebanon is not part of the ceasefire agreement has certainly raised concern tonight here in Lebanon.
Nada Bashir, critical reporting throughout the course of the day from Lebanon. Thank you very much. Well, also today, House Republicans ignored Democratic efforts to introduce a measure that would rein in President Trump's military powers. Democrats still fuming over Trump's threat earlier this week to take out Iranian civilization.
The words and actions of this president have proved that he is unhinged and unwell.
Threatening genocide is not a negotiating tactic.
Let's have a vote to end this war, because this ceasefire is a joke. This war should never have happened in the first place, and Congress deserves a say, and the American people deserve a say.
Lebanon health officials say in 38 days of conflict, nearly 1,900 people have died and more than 6,000 have been injured. The World Health Organization now warning that hospitals are running out of supplies and there are shortages of some essential medications.
If the current situation and the current demand actually continue and the current escalation continue, probably the country may be facing a very real risk of critical shortage, including trauma supplies, surgical materials, blood products, chronic medications, and any other further disruption could seriously hinder the ability of providing timely, adequate care for both emergency and ongoing health needs.
The Lebanese health ministry says more than 15% of the country's population has been displaced. In response, the charity CARE, which has worked in Lebanon for the last 20 years, has been delivering drinking water, meals and bedding to those without homes. Michelle Nunn is president and CEO of CARE. So, listen, I mean, we can rattle off the numbers, but can you give us any idea what the people of Lebanon and also your staff are dealing with right now?
Yeah, it's an extraordinary crisis, as you just articulated. So, for instance, our CARE team members that are responding to the needs and supplying mattresses, blankets, food, water are also displaced in many instances themselves. As an example, one of the stories that our team shared just this week was of encountering in their distribution a woman who was 4 days from having given birth through a C-section with her baby on the sidewalk. And so that's an example of what the human reality is right now. It is a terrible crisis for over 1 million people that are displaced and for literally everyone who is living in Lebanon who is impacted.
Israel has conducted airstrikes in Lebanon even after the ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran went into effect. Lebanon says that nearly 200 people were killed and hundreds wounded in strikes that hit densely populated areas of Beirut. Israel says the strikes targeted the Iranian-backed militant group, issuing evacuation orders for southern Beirut earlier today. Tanks were seen today on both sides of the border.
The U.S. and Israel insist the truce does not include Lebanon, contradicting Iran and key mediator Pakistan.
Lebanon says at least 10 people were killed today amid a national day of mourning. Let's discuss all of these developments with Nada Bashir, joining us live now from Beirut. We've also got Jeremy Diamond for us in Tel Aviv. Nada, let me start with you because we just got word that Benjamin Netanyahu has instructed his cabinet to actually begin live negotiations, or rather current negotiations with Lebanon. This is an important development. It's something that the Lebanese have wanted for quite some time. They've, of course, been caught in the middle of this. But the key issue is going to be disarming Hezbollah and how much control Lebanon as a state actually has over Hezbollah in that regard.
That's right. And of course, the Lebanese government has for some time now been pushing for talks and direct negotiations with the Israeli government. That has certainly been the position of the Lebanese president and prime minister. In fact, there have been moves to put pressure on Iran-backed Hezbollah to come to some sort of peace agreement as well to secure Lebanon's borders. Of course, the Lebanese government has previously written to the United Nations in that letter declaring that it has outlawed Hezbollah's military wing and that it is working to disarm the military wing of Hezbollah as a group. But of course, that clearly hasn't been the case, and we've seen further moves by the Lebanese government, as referenced by the Israeli Prime Minister's office, with regards to the opening and offer of negotiations. The Lebanese government has essentially called on its security forces to clear the capital, Beirut, of any non-state arms. And this is believed to be heavily focused on any Hezbollah actors who are armed and in the city. And of course, there has been mounting concern, mounting pressure across the city, across the country. We've been speaking to people on the ground telling us that they want an immediate and peaceful resolution to the war, that they do not want to see conflict in Lebanon. And we've been feeling the civilian impact of Israel's aerial assault, not only across Lebanon, but here as well in the capital, Beirut. As you mentioned, we saw the largest wave of airstrikes across the country since the war began. And we saw the impact of that here in the capital, where residential buildings, civilian buildings were struck and destroyed. Again, the Israeli military has said that it was targeting what it described as Hezbollah command and military targets. But the civilian impact has been clear. More than 180 people killed, at least nearly 900 people wounded. We've been speaking to families today who are still waiting to identify their dead. So there is a real feeling here of fear over what the next steps will look like, whether perhaps this indication of willingness to take part in talks between Israel and the Lebanese government will mean a ceasefire here in the country. And of course, this comes just hours after the Israeli military issued a new evacuation order for parts of southern Beirut, a broad area of southern Beirut, it has to be said, including areas that have not previously been under evacuation orders. So that has certainly raised concern. Many will be waiting tonight to see whether or not these talks, this offer of negotiations, does mean the beginning of some respite for many families here in Lebanon, or whether perhaps we will continue to see hostilities, and how, of course, how Hezbollah will respond to this.
All right, Nada Bashir in Lebanon for us. Let's go to Jerusalem and Jeremy Diamond. And Jeremy, first question, what caused this sudden decision from Prime Minister Netanyahu to issue these talks now with the Lebanese government? And the argument that we had heard all along for years now from the Israelis was that the Lebanese military either did not have the desire or the ability and capability to disarm Hezbollah. So what could change now?
Well, we're still working to learn details about exactly what led the Israeli prime minister to seek these negotiations at this very moment. But obviously, if you look at the context and the timing of this decision, you can start to put some of the pieces together. I mean, we've been talking over the course of the last day or so about the fact that this continued Israeli attacks in Lebanon could potentially put at risk the broader ceasefire between the United States and Iran. We have seen the Iranians repeatedly object to continued Israeli attacks. We have also seen the Pakistanis talk about it. And into all of that comes the Israeli prime minister with this promise of negotiations with Lebanon to address the issue of disarming Hezbollah, something that the Lebanese government has been seeking for weeks now, basically since very shortly after Hezbollah began firing rockets on Israel and Israel began retaliating with strikes of its own inside of Lebanon. Now, it's important to note that as of now, we have no indication that these talks also mean that Israel is going to cease fire in Lebanon. In the past, we have seen that Israel typically prefers to negotiate or to force its opponents to negotiate under fire, meaning that it will likely continue to strike even as it negotiates, but we don't yet have a very clear sense of that. We heard the Vice President, J.D. Vance, yesterday talking about Israel potentially scaling back some of its strikes in Lebanon. And so, you know, perhaps that is what we could see from the Israelis here. But as Nada has been reporting on the ground, so far we haven't seen any indications of any kind of changed posture from the Israeli military. Multiple strikes that have taken place today, evacuation orders for the parts of southern Beirut, which typically precede additional Israeli military strikes. So we're just going to have to wait and see. I am, however, learning from an Israeli official that Ambassador Leiter, the Israeli ambassador to Washington, is going to be the official leading the Israeli side of the negotiations. It's also important to note that Israel and Lebanon have held direct talks in the last year. They held them at a relatively lower level in the southern Lebanese city of Nakura in December of 2025. Those were Israel, Lebanon, and the United States were all at that negotiating table. But all of that, of course, fell apart subsequent to the launch of this war in Iran, Hezbollah then entering the fray, and a new explosion of this conflict between Israel and Hezbollah.
All right, Jeremy Diamond in Tel Aviv for us, Nada Bashir. Thank you so much, both of you. I want to bring in CNN Chief International Correspondent Clarissa Ward, who is in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. So, Clarissa, on the one hand, things are quieter today. No missile launches reported from Iran over the last 12 or so hours. But at the same time, things are not status quo as to where they were before the war. I believe with regards to the Strait of Hormuz, only 4 oil vessels were able to pass through or were allowed to pass through yesterday compared to the 100 or so daily before the start of the war. So what are you hearing from sources there on the ground about the state of this fragile ceasefire?
Well, I think there is broad optimism that today has been much quieter than yesterday. Yesterday, there was a feeling of distinct anxiety that was creeping in. Today, for the first time, the UAE reporting not a single attack on its airspace. So this is meaningful progress. But the issue of the Strait of Hormuz is one that is pivotal for the Gulf countries, and the issue of Iran seemingly under the impression that they will continue to implement control of the strait is, simply put, Bianna, a red line for the GCC countries. And what their concern is going forward is regarding these U.S.-Iran direct talks that are expected to get underway in Islamabad on Saturday. They want to be sure that their security concerns and guarantees that address those concerns are baked in to any agreement that comes about as a result of those negotiations. At the same time, they understand what a tall order that may be, given the status quo right now with the U.S. and Iran singing from very, very, very different hymn sheets, and indeed one 10-point plan versus another 10-point plan versus the 15-point plan. And by the way, I should add the specter or the possibility that these talks could even break apart before they've even started, given that Iran has issued a number of threats saying that if Lebanon is not declared as being part of this ceasefire agreement, that they would not entertain continuing this ceasefire or indeed these bilateral negotiations. Now, part of that may be braggadocio, largely for domestic consumption, but certainly we have seen statements today from Iran's prime minister, from Iran's foreign minister, and critically from Mohammad Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Iran's parliament, who is one of the central Iranian interlocutors in these U.S. talks, essentially saying that if this is not explicitly articulated by the U.S. and the Israelis, and now it remains to be seen whether this move from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu towards some kind of direct negotiation between Israel and Lebanon will be enough to appease the Iranians, and they will indeed continue to meet in Islamabad on Saturday. So I would say definitely a brighter picture here than it was a day ago, but still a number of clouds looming overhead. And again, the central issue for many of these Gulf countries is, of course, that vital Strait of Hormuz, which continues to be under somewhat of a chokehold. Even the Iranians saying that at this stage, due to the security concerns to the mines and other issues, they can only let in a maximum of 15 ships a day, Bianna.
Israel has just announced a step that could help stabilize a critical ceasefire between the US and Iran. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he's seeking direct talks with Lebanon focused on disarming Hezbollah. Sources tell CNN US President Donald Trump requested those negotiations and a pullback in Israeli attacks on Lebanon. It is unclear whether Israel will scale back at this hour. Earlier today, Iran's president said Israeli strikes on Lebanon make negotiations, quote, meaningless. And those blistering attacks, which health officials say killed more than 300 people on Wednesday, have threatened to plunge the region back into an all-out war. Israel and the US insist Lebanon wasn't included in the temporary truce. Iran and key mediator Pakistan says it was. Pakistani authorities, meanwhile, are tightening security in Islamabad ahead of high-stakes talks this weekend meant to really shore up the ceasefire. US Vice President J.D. Vance will lead the Trump administration's delegation. Iran is still apparently using the Strait of Hormuz, as you can see there, as leverage. It says the strait is open, but it's allowing only a trickle of ships to pass.
The Strait of Hormuz is open. Of course, there are technical restrictions because of the war zone and because of many arrangements that Iran did during the war, during this aggression against Iran. So there are some technical restraints, and this is why that all the ships that they would like to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, they have to communicate with our army and our military contact points there.
Well, we're joined now by Elena Trine at the White House, and Clarissa Ward is in Riyadh. I would like to start with Clarissa this hour. And Clarissa, as we just laid out there in our introduction, this ceasefire is very much being put to the test over two key issues. That is the Strait of Hormuz, as we just mentioned there, and Lebanon, the latter, as we've been hearing, facing another round of evacuation orders, all while Prime Minister Netanyahu calls for negotiations with Lebanon. How do you assess the status of the ceasefire and the timing, of course, of these negotiations with Lebanon?
Well, Issa, I think there's no question we are in a much better position this evening than when I last spoke to you yesterday. This morning, well, I should say overnight, there were continued Israeli strikes on Lebanon. That after those devastating attacks left more than 300 Lebanese people dead. Hezbollah, in turn, flew rockets into, or fired, I should say, rockets into northern Israel this morning. The Israelis issuing an evacuation order for a large swath of the southern suburbs of Beirut, the Dahia area, as it's known, which is a Hezbollah stronghold. And And all of that was really feeding fears that this could completely scupper these face-to-face negotiations in Islamabad on Saturday. We had statements from Iran's parliamentary speaker, from the foreign minister, from the prime minister, effectively threatening to pull out of the ceasefire and negotiations if this considered. And it just may be that Prime Minister Netanyahu's announcement that Israel and Lebanon would hold direct talks with a view to ending this conflict, that is the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, might have averted a very challenging situation. And I think you can be sure that there was an enormous amount of U.S. pressure behind the scenes here to make this happen. Also, an important note here in the Gulf, which yesterday, as we talked about, was still being bombarded with drones and missiles, particularly in the UAE. It has been a remarkably quiet day. The first time since this war began that the UAE reported no projectiles, no drones, no missiles being fired into its airspace. So that is being seen as a positive indication here in the Gulf. But there are still concerns, as you mentioned, about the Strait of Hormuz, Iran continuing to say that it will negotiate access and it alone, and that only 15 ships can pass through the strait a day maximum at the moment. And so the Gulf countries really want to be sure that as the U.S. and Iran head to Islamabad to hold those face-to-face talks with each other, that there will be security guarantees for the Gulf baked into that agreement, Isa.
Yeah. Clarissa, stay with us. Let me go to Elena. It's clear, Elena, that the Strait of Hormuz is critical for President Trump, of course. Lebanon, critical for Iran. And we are learning in the last hour or so that it was President Trump who asked Netanyahu to have these direct negotiations with Beirut. And I'm seeing in the last few moments as well that President Donald Trump told NBC News that he asked Benjamin Netanyahu, to be, quote, a little more low-key. Look ahead, frame this as we look ahead, of course, to these meetings in Islamabad this weekend. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, Isa, I think this interview, and I'm just seeing it as well, coming across on our wires in the last few moments, I think is really notable to the context of everything that Clarissa just laid out about the importance and really, I think the United States recognizing the need to intervene here in order to keep this ceasefire from breaking down. The president told NBC, I want to quote him here just because I have this in front of me. The president told NBC, quote, "I spoke with Bibi and he's going to low-key it. I just think we have to be sort of a little more low-key." He added in this interview that he believes the Israelis are going to be scaling back operations in Lebanon. Of course, we have to wait and see whether or not this will be enough for the Iranians and to keep this ceasefire alive. But clearly, the White House working to try and avert any sort of breakdown over this issue specifically. But to your other more broader question, Isa, this meeting on Saturday is going to be a big test, I think, of this entire process. From the conversations I've been having all day with White House officials, they kind of frame it as what they're hoping will be the start of several intense negotiations. I know that in my conversations, despite what we heard from the president overnight in a Truth Social post saying that the army and the military are standing by in case this ceasefire breaks down, they are really hoping that this is the end of fighting in the region and that the U.S. won't have to continue with its military campaign and that they will be able to reach a much more longer-term, lasting type of peace deal. Of course, that's a very optimistic approach to this, particularly with all of the confusion and back and forth kind of disagreements we've been talking about over the last 24 hours. But that is currently at least the White House view of this. And part of the reason, too, this is going to be a big moment is because of the presence of Vice President J.D. Vance. Not only am I told that it's kind of him lending a certain level of credence, given that he is the number 2 in this White House, next to the president, of course, but also that, you know, the Iranians and the intermediaries, including Pakistan, also recognize Vance's anti-interventionist views from the past. And also, I think they're reading the same reports that all of us here in Washington are, including us putting them out ourselves, this idea that Vance was one of the only few high-ranking officials who kind of pushed Trump against some of these strikes to begin with. So So I'm told that that is also expected to lend a certain, different presence to these talks. But we really have to see what will happen. I think a huge question as well, of course, is really whether they can, come and broach the daylight between these different proposals. The Iranians have a 10-point proposal. The United States has a 15-point proposal. Whether that will be enough for the key starting point to really get these talks on Saturday to advance to another level and continue from there. But we'll really have to wait and see.
Yeah, a huge gap right now, and clearly a huge lack of trust as well. Elena Trina and Clarissa Ward, thank you, ladies. Great to see you once again. Well, let's get some perspective now from retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Layton. He's a CNN military analyst. Colonel, great to have you back on the show. Let me start with what we're hearing out of Lebanon. Both Clarissa, as you heard there, and Elena touching on this. I think this is the breaking news I've been following the last 2 hours or so. Prime Minister Netanyahu, as you know, said today that it wants to begin direct negotiations with Lebanon. It seems the U.S. president has been pushing him for that. We just heard in the last few minutes, speaking to NBC, that he spoke with Bibi. He says here, I spoke with Bibi and he's going to low-key it. I just think we have to be sort of a little more low-key. And that was a quote. At this moment, there's no indication that this means a temporary ceasefire while talks are ongoing. It's quite the contrary. How do you see this moment? How do you assess this, given the talks, of course, that Elena was discussing in Islamabad over the weekend?
Yeah, Issa, it's great to be with you again. The way I look at this is that this is an essential step by the Trump administration to really run these negotiations. And Israel could have basically played the role of spoiler in this particular case. And it's essential for the United States, from President Trump's point of view, that not happen. The Israelis and the U.S. do have divergent goals in mind here. And that's, I think, one of the key things that we have to really understand. On the one hand, the Israelis want actual regime change in Iran, and they look at Hezbollah is definitely related and definitely an Iranian proxy, but they also see it as an independent force in many respects, and they see any type of ceasefire in Iran as being an area where they can potentially take advantage of that and prosecute a war, or at least some attacks against forces like Hezbollah. And in this particular case, that really is not what the United States needs, because the Iranians do view this as a Middle East-wide ceasefire effort, and they want that to happen, and perhaps so that they can regroup, but also in a way so that they can really maximize any possible benefits for themselves and for their proxies from any negotiations in Islamabad or any other place that they might occur.
Yeah, and we heard that, in fact, this time yesterday from the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, who's basically saying that he wouldn't entertain a ceasefire unless Lebanon was actually included in his proposals. Let me go back to Hezbollah, because I think this is important. We had heard previously, Colonel, that the Lebanese government didn't have the ability. Critics may go as far as to say they didn't even have the desire to disarm Hezbollah. How do you assess the challenge here? Because Hezbollah has been degraded, as we've been reported, has been weakened, but clearly not disarmed. What we have seen, continues to see strikes even today on Israel. Just frame that for us.
Yeah, so Hezbollah is still a very potent force, Issa. And, when you look at the way in which they've conducted their operations, just like the Iranians, they are very good at basically asymmetric warfare. Even the devastating effects of the pager attack and the decimation of Hezbollah's leadership has really not resulted in an elimination of that group as a danger to Israel. And that's why the Israelis want to move forward and control southern Lebanon. They want to control the area at least up to the Litani River and perhaps even beyond that. And they do that, they want to do that for the security of northern Israel's population. At least that's how they see it. But as far as the Lebanese government is concerned, they have a better chance at this particular moment in time to be able to control Hezbollah and to limit Hezbollah's activities against Israel. However, they still have significant challenges in doing so, in spite of Hezbollah's weakness. Compared to how it was just a year or two ago, they still are a potent force in Lebanon, still control vast territory within this country, and they also control a large portion of the population. So Hezbollah is still a potent force within Lebanese politics, and for the Lebanese government to be able to control them, it's going to be more a factor of negotiation within Lebanon as opposed to actually using physical force against Hezbollah, and that's going to be, I think, difficult to achieve.
Well, returning to our top story, the fragile truce in the Middle East, events are really developing on two fronts this hour. Front one is Pakistan, where Iranian and US negotiators are due to meet over the weekend in an effort, of course, to hammer out a lasting ceasefire. Front two, as we told you at the top of the show, is Lebanon, which Israel has been pounding heavily this week. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he wants to hold direct talks with Lebanese leaders about reaching a peace. But at the same time, the Israeli military has issued evacuation orders for parts of Beirut. Nada Bashir is in Beirut for us this hour in Lebanon. So Nada, I mean, peace talks, but no ceasefire, and talks, it seems, that will be held under fire. How is this being received where you are?
Well, look, Issa, the Lebanese government has been clear for weeks now that they have wanted peaceful negotiations to take place with Israel, to come to some sort of agreement to ensure the security of Lebanon's borders. And while we haven't had an official response just yet from the Lebanese government, we have been hearing from Lebanese officials who have told CNN that neither the Foreign Ministry nor the Presidential Palace at this stage have been formally or officially notified of an invitation from the Israeli government for those negotiations to take place. But according to these officials, the government remains very clear on one key point. There cannot be any negotiations while under fire. And of course, that is the concern here, that while there may be the prospect of peace talks between the Lebanese government and the Israeli government, that Lebanon will still be coming under attack, as it has been now for over a month. And of course, there is real concern given the civilian impact that we have seen now for weeks, the death toll now rising to over 1,800, more than 1 million people displaced. That's 20% of Lebanon's entire population in the space of just over a month. And of course, there is concern around whether that ceasefire, if it is agreed upon, can be held in place, given the fact that, of course, we did see ceasefire talks back in November 2024. Many would argue that neither side, neither the Israeli government and the Israeli military, nor Hezbollah, of course, not the Lebanese government, but Hezbollah forces in the south, adhering to the terms of that agreement. And of course, that is also another key concern here, the division between the Lebanese government and Hezbollah forces, who have, of course, been the primary source of fire from Lebanon into Lebanese territory. Important to remind our viewers, of course, that the Lebanese government had previously written to the United Nations outlawing Hezbollah's military wing. We've now heard from the Lebanese Prime Minister calling on its security forces to rid the capital, Beirut, of all non-state arms. This appears to be in a bid to really put pressure on Hezbollah and to move towards a diplomatic resolution. And the need couldn't be more urgent given the large-scale wave of attacks that we saw yesterday, not just in Beirut, but across the country.
Yeah. And in just a moment, Nada, I'm going to be speaking to Jan Egeland, the chief of the Norwegian Refugee Council. I mean, give us a sense then of what you and the team have seen on the ground, because now we're having these talks, potential talks of direct negotiations. Are people staying put? Are they going back home? What are they going back to? These are huge questions at this hour for civilians.
Look, there is still a deep sense of insecurity here in Lebanon. Issa, the Lebanese government has been very clear, and the Lebanese military warning people not to return to their homes in the south. There is still, of course, clear hostilities on the ground, in the air, particularly in southern Lebanon. But also there are concerns around the expansion of Israel's military assault on the country. And of course, while we've heard from the Israeli military repeatedly saying the bodies of their loved ones. So of course, there is a real sense here of people being on edge, waiting to see how things play out and whether or not the prospect of these talks actually means some respite for the Lebanese people.
Yeah, we heard from WHO, a representative of Lebanon, saying today the hospitals are running out of supplies today. So very dire situation indeed on the humanitarian front. Nada, great to see you. Thank you to you and the team on the ground there. While international condemnation is mounting over Israel's massive strikes across Lebanon on Wednesday, Nada was referring to there, which Lebanese health officials say killed at least 300 303 people and wounded more than 1,100 others. French President Emmanuel Macron condemned what he described as indiscriminate Israeli strikes on Lebanon, saying they pose a direct threat to the sustainability of the ceasefire. One man who lives in a neighborhood affected by Israeli strikes describes what the situation is like on the ground. Have a listen.
I did not have time even to call all my friends or family. The majority of my family are still living in the south. Some of them were able to leave. Some of them did not have a destination. And the infrastructure, as you know, and the situation is very catastrophic. Again, from also a humanitarian angle. So you start to feel like I'm looking for my safety, for the safety of my small family.
Hours after the US president announced the agreement Tuesday evening, just after 8 o'clock local time in the States, the IDF hit Lebanon harder than ever before in this latest war. CNN's Nada Bashir filed this report on the devastation in Beirut.
Homes destroyed, the air filled with smoke, the site of yet another deadly attack. This is the aftermath of an enormous Israeli military strike here in Beirut. This is one of the more than 100 targets, according to the Israeli military, that they believe to be Hezbollah targets struck today. But you can see behind me, these appear to be residential buildings, apartments. This is a very busy area full of shops and a busy roadway. There would have been many people at this site and around the area at the time of the blast, and now emergency services are working to dig through the rubble for victims. The Lebanese health ministry says hundreds have been killed and wounded. Adding to the more than 1,500 people the ministry said Tuesday have been killed in Lebanon over the course of this war. Hopes that the ceasefire between the US, Israel and Iran would extend to Lebanon were quickly dashed, just hours after it came into effect.
We were sitting drinking coffee like normal, and then we heard a very loud noise. 3 blasts at the same time. And then we saw the smoke, but we couldn't tell where it was coming from. What kind of life is this? We don't know what will happen in the next hour. The last thing we could imagine is this kind of attack occurring in the center of Beirut.
In the neighborhood of Tel el-Khayat, first responders attempt to rescue survivors after a section of a residential building was completely leveled. Both the US and Israel have claimed Lebanon was never part of the ceasefire agreement, despite claims to the contrary from Pakistan's Prime Minister, who helped broker the deal. Now, fears of a further escalation, including a possible retaliation from Hezbollah ally Iran, has left many fearful over what now lies ahead for the people of Lebanon. Nada Bashir, CNN in Beirut.
And in the past hour, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, has issued a broad evacuation order for several neighborhoods in southern Beirut in Lebanon, including some areas that had not previously been targeted. I'm going to keep an eye on this story and on this skyline. More news after this. Middle days for the fragile ceasefire between Iran and the US in the run-up to peace talks scheduled in Pakistan on Saturday. Iran says its delegation will arrive in Islamabad in the coming hours. Well, at the same time, US President Donald Trump has a message for Tehran saying US military assets and personnel will remain where they are until a full agreement is reached. His defense chief said much the same thing to reporters at the Pentagon. Have a listen.
Sure. Yeah, we'll be hanging around. We're not going anywhere. We're going to make sure Iran complies with this ceasefire and then ultimately comes to the table and makes a deal. Our troops are prepared to defend, prepared to go on offense, prepared to restart at a moment's notice.
Well, a sticking point in all of this, you will be aware, is Israel's continued attacks on Lebanon. Iran says Israel is violating this ceasefire. US Vice President J.D. Vance takes a different view.
I think this comes from a legitimate misunderstanding. I think the Iranians thought that the ceasefire included Lebanon, and it just didn't. We never made that promise. We never indicated that was going to be the case. What we said is that the ceasefire would be focused on Iran and the ceasefire would be focused on America's allies, both Israel and the Gulf Arab states.
Well, CNN's Jeremy Diamond live for us in Tel Aviv. Let me start with what we know about Israel's operations in Lebanon as we speak.
Yeah, well, as we are seeing, there is no slowdown in Israel's attacks on Lebanon, despite Iran's insistence that Lebanon should be included as part of the ceasefire, despite the statement from the Pakistani mediators that Lebanon was supposed to be included in the ceasefire. Instead, what we are seeing today are continued airstrikes, continued ground activity from the Israeli military in Lebanon. Strikes today have already killed at least 10 people, including women and children, according to Lebanon's national news agency. In addition to that, we're seeing that the Israeli military is clearly preparing for more strikes in the Lebanese capital of Beirut, where the Israeli military issued new broad evacuation orders for parts of the southern suburbs of Beirut, likely a forecast for additional strikes to take place in those areas. This all comes after yesterday we saw the Israeli military carry out the most intense wave of strikes in Lebanon that we have seen since the beginning of this current war, with at least 182 people who were killed in those strikes, more than 890 people injured, according to Lebanon's health ministry. Many of these strikes took place in densely populated neighborhoods, densely populated urban areas of the Lebanese capital of Beirut, stretching far beyond those southern suburbs of the Dahia, which are known to be a Shia majority area and a Hezbollah stronghold. Instead, some of these strikes took place in central areas of Beirut, and we saw, of course, the number of civilian casualties continuing to rise as a result of that. Now, all of this is, of course, having an impact on the potential success of the ceasefire that has now taken hold in a very, very fragile manner between the United States and Iran. While both the U.S. and Israel have withheld strikes on Iran, Iran is also not striking Israel or the United States at this time. We are not seeing that Strait of Hormuz be opened in a significant way to commercial ships and oil tankers. Only a handful of ships have passed through that Strait of Hormuz since this ceasefire agreement was reached. It is, of course, a key condition on the Iranian side in order for this ceasefire to be maintained.
To your earlier point, the Pakistan ambassador to the US specifically confirming to me yesterday, Wednesday, that Lebanon is, or certainly was, included in what is a ceasefire between the US and Iran. Is it clear, Jeremy, whether Israel is on board with these US efforts to end the Iran war?
Well, certainly publicly, we heard the Israeli Prime Minister last night, expressing his support for President Trump's efforts to end this diplomatically, committing to the ceasefire agreement as it relates to Iran. Privately, we know it's a very different story. Israeli officials have enormous misgivings about the possibility of strikes, they believe that they can still carry out strikes in Lebanon, and they have maintained their right to do so. And of course, that is the linchpin issue that could unravel this ceasefire altogether. We heard today from Mohammed Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Iran's parliament, the man who's likely going to be sitting down at the negotiating table in Islamabad, once again saying that these are ceasefire violations and that they will carry, quote, explicit costs and strong responses, calling on Israel to, quote, extinguish the fire immediately. So this is a major issue and one that is still, as of yet, unresolved. And the question is, what is the United States going to do about it? Are they ultimately going to pressure Israel to stop carrying out these attacks? We haven't seen that so far. Both President Trump and J.D. Vance insisting Israel still has the right to carry out strikes in Lebanon. Or, is this going to lead to Iran resuming fire as a result in retaliation for what's happening in Lebanon? So a whole host of unanswered questions right now, and a very, very delicate moment in what is an extraordinarily shaky ceasefire.
Can I ask you, before I let you go, briefly, since this ceasefire came into place effectively, and we know it's fragile, we haven't seen in the past 24 hours, at least, Iranian attacks here in the Gulf. What's the situation where you are?
Yeah, same here. No Iranian ballistic missile attacks since the first hours of that ceasefire. We saw a few rounds of ballistic missile fire towards Israel in the first hour after the Pakistani prime minister tweeted out that ceasefire had taken immediate effect. We also saw Israeli strikes that were taking place at the same time. But within a few hours, it seems both Israel and Iran began respecting the ceasefire, at least as it relates to strikes on each other. A very different story, of course, as we're talking about in Lebanon. And again, the Iranians now, threatening to a response here if Israel does not stop its attacks in Lebanon.
Yeah, good to have you out of Tel Aviv. Thank you. Well, European leaders are in region. Belgium's foreign minister says one of the massive Israeli airstrikes on Beirut on Wednesday happened within a few hundred meters of him. Here in Abu Dhabi, the British Prime Minister arrived in the past few hours as part of his visit to the Gulf, and another key European official in Abu Dhabi today. I sat down with the EU's Foreign Affairs Chief, Kaja Kallas. We spoke following her meetings in Saudi Arabia with the country's foreign minister and the Gulf Cooperation Council's Secretary General. She is navigating concerns from the Gulf and weeks of scathing criticism from the US, pressing Europe to take stronger action, very specifically in the Strait of Hormuz. Today, the head of the national oil company here in the UAE said plainly the strait is not open. Quote, access is being restricted, conditioned and controlled. Conditional passage is not passage. It is controlled by another name. Stability now depends on restoring real flows, not partial access, not temporary measures, not controlled passage, but full and reliable supply. He has also described Iran's chokehold as economic terrorism. Well, I asked Kallas if she understands that palpable frustration. Governments in the Middle East and beyond have condemned Israeli strikes on Lebanon on Wednesday, which killed 182 people. In the region, Qatar's foreign ministry described Israel's conduct as heinous, while Turkey accused Israel of undermining peace efforts. Meanwhile, Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez denounced his Israeli counterpart Benjamin Netanyahu for showing contempt for life, and I quote him there. Well, the attack, which was the largest against Lebanon since the war began, is threatening to derail the ceasefire currently in place between the US and Iran. CNN's Nada Bashir has the latest from Beirut.
Homes destroyed, the air filled with smoke, the site of yet another deadly attack. This is the aftermath of an enormous Israeli military strike here in Beirut. This is one of the more than 100 targets, according to the Israeli military, that they believe to be Hezbollah targets struck today. But you can see behind me, these appear to be residential buildings, apartments. This is a very busy area full of shops and a busy roadway. There would have been many people at this site and around the area at the time of the blast, and now emergency services are working to dig through the rubble for victims. The Lebanese health ministry says hundreds have been killed and wounded. Adding to the more than 1,500 people the ministry said Tuesday have been killed in Lebanon over the course of this war. Hopes that the ceasefire between the US, Israel and Iran would extend to Lebanon were quickly dashed, just hours after it came into effect.
We were sitting drinking coffee like normal, and then we heard a very loud noise. 3 blasts at the same time. And then we saw the smoke, but we couldn't tell where it was coming from. What kind of life is this? We don't know what will happen in the next hour. The last thing we could imagine is this kind of attack occurring in the center of Beirut.
In the neighborhood of Tellet el-Khayat, first responders attempt to rescue survivors after a section of a residential building was completely leveled. Both the US and Israel have claimed Lebanon was never part of the ceasefire agreement, despite claims to the contrary from Pakistan's Prime Minister, who helped broker the deal. Now, fears of a further escalation, including a possible retaliation from Hezbollah ally Iran, has left many fearful over what now lies ahead for the people of Lebanon. Nada Bashir, CNN in Beirut.
Well, Iran's top officials are stressing that Lebanon is included in this ceasefire deal, although the US and Israel both say otherwise. I want to speak to Firas Maksad. He's managing director for the Middle East and North Africa at the Eurasia Group. Good friend of this show. Very much appreciate you on your analysis. Is always so good for us. Lebanon remains a sticking point as far as these talks are concerned, and as far as this ceasefire is concerned. I just wonder, how hard do you believe Iran is going to push on this?
Becky, it's good to be back on the show. This is a crucial test for the Iranians. First, Hezbollah is the primary ally outside of Iran's borders. It came to the defense and assistance of Iran in its war against America and Israel. This was a decision that was deeply unpopular, not only throughout Lebanon, but also in Hezbollah's own support base in Lebanon's Shia community. And so for Iran to leave Hezbollah hanging as it then negotiates a separate ceasefire itself with America and by extension by Israel is a very bad look for the Iranians, one that risks their continued domination in Lebanon and the future of its ally there, Hezbollah. It's also a test that the Israelis are administering to Iran, together with the Americans, I should say. If in fact the Iranians accept to allow this to continue and to proceed with negotiations and talks in Islamabad with the United States, that is a signal of Iranian weakness. If Iran is in fact still very powerful, able to fire ballistic missiles and drones, it would not have to forego the Lebanon card and its relationship with Hezbollah as a result of that Israeli challenge. So for all those reasons, Lebanon and the Lebanese front is emerging as a key litmus test and a key issue in the future of the ceasefire between the US and Iran.
Yeah, that's absolutely crucial to point out. Look, Israel has said it still has objectives to meet. Benjamin Netanyahu signaling that strikes could continue. Is Israel the wild card here at this point? How much confidence is there that Donald Trump can restrain Benjamin Netanyahu? And I guess I'm talking about certainly on the Lebanon front, but then on the wider Iran front as well.
You know, Bibi Netanyahu is many things, but he's not stupid. And he understands that President Trump has done more for him and for Israel than any other American president in recent history. I do believe that when President Trump piles the pressure on Bibi to stop, Bibi will stop. But that's simply not the case at this point when it comes to Lebanon. In fact, I would say that the American administration has been guilty of neglecting Lebanon. There is no point person in Washington, D.C. that's been handling the Lebanon file. At some point, this was a file that was given to Morgan Ortagus, a senior American official, then to Tom Barak, and now there is no senior American official following the Lebanon card and the Lebanon angle for this. So, and what we've seen is that J.D. Vance has been forced to comment on this in the past 24 hours. First, there was the assertion that Lebanon was in fact not part of the ceasefire, which the Pakistani interlocutors and mediators dispute, but then that America would apply some pressure on Israel to rein in, not end, but rein in some of its activities in Lebanon. And that's simply not playing out on the ground with today mass evacuation orders from large swaths of Beirut's southern suburbs. So I don't believe that the U.S. at this point is applying pressure to bring things to a close, but should it choose to, I do think that the U.S. can bring Israel to stop its activities in Lebanon.
I want to ask you, we know that the Lebanese president has offered to go into talks with Israel. We've seen nothing further. What are the chances of separate Israel-Lebanon talks for a ceasefire in the first instance and a further solution, a peaceful solution?
Becky, you always ask the right questions, and that's exactly where I want to go, because I started out by pointing to that litmus test right now that is being administered by Israel on Iran, and that attempt to take or to create a split between the Lebanon card and Iran. It's Iran's domination of Lebanon. There's certainly a point of view that argues that any ceasefire in Lebanon should not be the result of an Israeli-Iranian understanding or an American-Iranian understanding, that there's an interest in empowering the actual Lebanese government and the Lebanese state. For the first time, you do have a Lebanese government that is willing to have direct negotiations with Israel, including over a ceasefire, including a decision by that Lebanese government to dismantle Hezbollah's military and security infrastructure, not because it's an Israeli interest, but it's because the majority of the Lebanese people have had enough being dragged into one war after another on behalf of Iran and other regional interests. So it stands to be argued that that offer by the Lebanese president, by the Lebanese prime minister, to have those discussions is probably the best way forward, longer term, to ensure peace on that border between Lebanon and Israel.
Before I let you go, I want to get back to the talks this weekend, which are scheduled Saturday between the US and Iran. There is this ceasefire in place, albeit fragile because of what we're seeing going on in Lebanon. The UAE, where I am, and you know this country very well, says it is, and I quote here, seeking further clarification on this ceasefire with Iran, stopping short of welcoming the pause. And Ammar Gargash, who is the UAE diplomatic advisor to the president here, posting on X, quote, the era of courtesies has passed and frankness has become a necessity. Our collective stance must be firm and clear towards the features of the upcoming phase in a way that enhances stability and security in the region. You and I are close watchers of what goes on in the Gulf. What he says will not surprise you, I'm sure. It doesn't surprise me. But it's important that the wider audience understands what you make of that message.
Becky, I recall being on your show a couple of months ago and making the argument of two emerging coalitions in the region, one in which Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, and others loom large, another under the rubric of the Abrahamic Accords, which obviously the UAE is part of. I think it's very clear that the ceasefire as it's been negotiated right now is very much coming through that block of countries, Pakistan, the relationship with Saudi Arabia, the meeting of the Quad, the foreign ministers last week in Islamabad, that those countries increasingly favor a ceasefire between the US and Iran. The UAE in a much more skeptical place. And I had off-record conversations just yesterday with a senior UAE official. The UAE position is, if Donald Trump wants to attempt to get to a deal with the Iranians through talks over a 2-week period, a ceasefire, go right ahead. But just as long as we're very clear what the objectives are, the reopening of the Straits of Hormuz, no longer contested and controlled by the Iranians, the highly enriched uranium, the limitations on Iran's ballistic missiles. And if you think that Iran has been weakened to an extent that it is now ready to accept these conditions, let's go and try. But a great deal of skepticism about the ceasefire and what it could lead to from the Emirati compared to others in the region.
New tonight, Tomahawks under pressure. The United States reportedly firing at least 850 Tomahawks in the Iran war so far, nearly 9 times the number the military is expected to receive the entire fiscal year, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's a serious problem that threatens American security, and the Trump administration is trying to find another way to produce long-range cruise missiles. Alex Michelson is out front.
We would call this really the world's first low-cost cruise missile.
They are designing and 3D printing future weapons of war at Divergent Technologies.
Is this the first cruise missile that was entirely 3D printed?
Yes.
And that's not being done by anybody else?
No.
This cruise missile made 10 times cheaper than previous models and designed and built in weeks instead of years.
We engineer, manufacture our own printer.
CEO Lucas Zinger gives us an exclusive tour of company headquarters in Torrance, California, where U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth recently visited.
What was his big takeaway from this?
His takeaway was, we need more of it.
The company was founded 12 years ago. At first, they focused on 3D printing auto parts, but soon discovered they can do a lot more than that.
You can go from a suspension part for auto to an airframe for a cruise missile to a part for a fighter jet, all using the same machine.
So real simply, what is a 3D printer?
So when you think 3D printing, think additive manufacturing. Instead of starting with a block of material and shaving it down to reach your final form, you are growing the part layer by layer, starting from nothing and constructing the final shape.
For security reasons, we can't show you the missiles being printed, but we can show you these auto parts, which are made in the exact same way. So if you look in this window right here, you see individual layers being printed, one at a time. And this screen shows you the progress. It's about 80% of the way done right now, about a 16-hour process, and it's about 4,000 layers to make that part a reality.
The process starts with Divergent software powered by AI, creating a design much faster than traditional modeling methods. For example, Divergent partnered with Mach Industries to create this drone.
We went from whiteboard session to first flight in 71 days. And that was the fastest on record that had been achieved in the industry.
Divergent supplies companies including Lockheed Martin, RTX, and Co-Aspire on defense.
Has there been an increase in demand with the war with Iran?
Oh, yes. Yes. We focused on munitions starting 3 years ago. And that was a good bet.
The same machines printed all of these parts for Zinger's car company.
All of the aluminum you see here, all of the primary structure.
They partner with brands like McLaren and Aston Martin to create a car already setting track records in California.
And that's all thanks to the 3D printing technology?
Yes.
3D printing technology Divergent wants to eventually replicate in factories across the country, producing the weapons of the future.
This is really a game changer for war.
Yes.
Alex, so it's incredible. We think about drones, right, and how low cost they are versus some of the most sophisticated missiles in the world, those Tomahawks. I mean, are the missiles that you were just showing us 3D printed? I mean, are those a matter of future, or are those now? Are they being used in the Iran war now?
So, for national security purposes, they're not allowed to say. But if you look at the facts, it certainly seems that way. The fact that the defense secretary came there, the fact that they're supplying all of the major defense contractors that are part of putting out the missiles, and the fact that they have so much demand right now in particular. Aaron.
I mean, it is really incredible to look at that and just think about the complete change in warfare and these it's seemingly antiquated production lines for those traditional missiles. It is stunning. Alex, thank you so much.
Tonight, is Israel an obstacle to Donald Trump's exit strategy? For a second day, Israel launched another fresh round of strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon, to which the Iranian-backed terror group responded. Lebanon's health ministry says that more than 300 people have been killed and hundreds more wounded. The question of whether Lebanon was part of the ceasefire agreement with Iran remains unclear. Iran says it was, but the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu disagrees.
I want to tell you, there is no ceasefire in Lebanon. We are continuing to strike Hezbollah with force, and we will not stop until we restore your security.
An Israeli and U.S. official tell CNN the talks between Israel and Lebanon are expected to begin at the State Department, but two Lebanese officials say they haven't been invited to those talks, with one saying there would be, quote, no negotiations under fire. President Trump tonight telling NBC, quote, I spoke with Bibi and he's going to low-key it. I just think that they have to be sort of a little more low-key, adding that he thinks Israel is scaling back its operation in Lebanon. But Iran's parliament speaker says that it's clear Lebanon was covered under the ceasefire deal, warning that time is running out. This is what we were just discussing. I mean, the rhetoric on the Iranian side in response to this confusion, which frankly, under normal circumstances should not have happened. This confusion is central now to whether or not the two sides think they can trust each other.
Some breaking news from Iran. A foreign ministry spokesman tonight saying that talks to end the war are contingent on the United States adhering to its ceasefire commitments. Those commitments, this spokesman said, include a ceasefire in Lebanon. I want to get perspective now from former Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton. He was also UN ambassador during the George W. Bush administration. Ambassador, the president is clearly unhappy with Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz, as I imagine anybody would be. Should he be surprised that nothing has really changed despite the ceasefire?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think this is going to turn out to be a mistake. The president so obviously wants a way out of this current situation that I think Iran senses weakness, and it's going to push and push until it sees how far it can get, and particularly before the face-to-face talks in Islamabad scheduled for this Saturday, they're going to see what they can get by forcing Trump to make concessions without them having to bargain for them.
It is interesting, you know, we played this FDR clip earlier of him speaking on the evening of the first of D-Day on June 6th back in 1944, rejecting the word conquest. When the president has repeatedly made threats and then backed off them, and is repeatedly, you know, late at night putting on social media more threats and threatening, you know, about not, even the latest one about not, you know, having a toll in the Strait of Hormuz, does it risk at a certain point people just not, I mean, adversaries just not believing him?
Well, I think that's what taco means. Trump always chickens out. They watch what he does, and he thinks he's bargaining, and they think he's just blustering. So they wait for him to bluster away, and then see if they can move him down into some other position without having to give anything up. By the way, the clip from Franklin Roosevelt, just so everybody understands it historically, was a prayer. It begins, Almighty Father, and goes on from there.
Which we said, the U.S. has obviously degraded Iran's military capability. Do you think the Iranian regime is in a stronger strategic position now than it was before the war?
No, I don't think so. I think on balance, the damage that we've done to their capabilities is very significant. The potential to take control of the Strait of Hormuz has been around for a long, long time. And we, for decades, discounted the possibility it would happen. Obviously, we're not going to do that again in the future. But I think it's really critical to understand that what Iran has been doing here has been visible for a long time. They've been fortifying islands in the Gulf and in the Strait right in front of us, and we haven't done anything about it. So I think we have to understand that as bad as this seems now, it will be infinitely worse if they get nuclear weapons. I don't think they're going to negotiate giving up control of the Strait. I think the way to do it is to take it from them. And obviously the president's, that's about the farthest thing from his mind at this point.
How do you think the U.S. should take the Strait of Hormuz from Iran?
Look, our military has known of this contingency for decades, and I don't know what the latest plans say, but I'm sure they've thought about it. It's my understanding they were doing many of the things one would need to do, going after the manufacturing of mines, going after the manufacturing of drones, going after the mine-laying ships, going after the fast boats. They may not be in a position to do it yet, but I think they should be. They should have continued to work on it. Obviously, they're not during a ceasefire. Ceasefire gives breathing room for the Iranians. It doesn't help us.
Does it make sense to you that there would be confusion over whether or not Israeli attacks on Lebanon were included in the ceasefire?
Well, there's no confusion between Netanyahu and Trump. They and J.D. Vance, for that matter, all three said the ceasefire did not include Lebanon. The confusion was on the Iranian and Pakistani side, and I think that shows what happens when you negotiate at great distances through intermediaries and people don't really understand what they're agreeing upon. We'll see if that changes on Saturday. I have a feeling that that this is going to be a very interesting test of the preferred Iranian negotiator for the U.S., J.D. Vance. They wanted Vance to lead the delegation, and they got him.
Ambassador Bolton, thanks very much.
Until 2:30 p.m. on Monday, April 13th, 2026.
Republicans ending today's brief House session, ignoring an attempt by Democrats to introduce a measure to restrain President Trump's authority in the Iran war. We're joined by Pennsylvania Democratic Congressman Chris Deluzio. He serves on the Armed Services Committee and is an Iraq war veteran who sailed through the Strait of Hormuz as a naval officer. Also with us, another combat vet, former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger. Congressman Deluzio, if most Republicans don't want to pass a war powers resolution even after President Trump threatened to kill off Iran's entire civilization, why should anyone think they're going to change their minds in the days ahead?
Well, I think they're seeing, like the American people, this war that Mr. Trump started has been a strategic disaster, and that's maybe putting it lightly. And look, that vote we had some weeks ago was close. We have procedural tools that we can use to force a vote. I'm not naive, and I'm optimistic some Republicans may wake up to what's happening and decide they want to assert themselves and our role in the Constitution and put a stop to this. And it's never the wrong time to do the right thing. So I invite them. This does not have to be a partisan thing. Let's stand up for the Constitution of the American people and bring our troops home.
Congressman Kinzinger, I mean, the president's clearly unhappy tonight with how Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz. Was he ill-advised to think that this ceasefire would change much? Or do you think he's also said he wouldn't mind some sort of joint toll sharing agreement with Iran?
Of course he wouldn't, because, I'm sure he'll profit from that. Look, the Strait of Hormuz is, whatever the official word is, a public waterway. The idea that Iran would have any control and any ability to toll, it's literally like the mafia, for $100 we'll make sure your business doesn't burn down. And to accept that is atrocious. And so, yes, I think the president was ill-advised to take this ceasefire, especially because they don't know what they agreed on. And it looks like we're going into negotiations having emboldened Iran. This is the difficulty with the war powers vote is, at this point, if you are going to begin a war, you need to make sure that you have the ability and the strategic patience to actually finish the job. And right now, clearly they haven't done that. And part of the issue, Anderson, is that Donald Trump is negotiating with himself in public. And if you're the Iranian regime, you're like, hey, we may be feeling a lot of pain, but this guy is clearly panicking, trying to get out of the war, so let's just wait him out a little bit. Donald Trump and his posts have done more damage to the effort to actually end this favorably than I think almost anything.
Yeah, Congressman Deluzio, I mean, if you are negotiating something and the person you're negotiating with wants to get out of the situation that they are in, just wants a deal to cut and run, that puts that person at an incredible disadvantage. That's a huge advantage for Iran.
Yeah. Well, and look, that's part of why you shouldn't have rushed into this war in the first place or gotten us into this war at all. And think about what the beginning 10 points of negotiations the Iranians have in front of them. Adam Kinzinger just mentioned part of it. Getting revenue from the Strait of Hormuz, that's a worse condition than we were in before the president started this war. Lifting of sanctions, continued enrichment, and more. Again, that is all worse than the situation in the Gulf before this war, and worse than what was happening under President Obama's nuclear deal that then President Donald Trump in his first term took our country out of. So he has managed to spend American lives and billions and potentially get to a place that is strategically worse for our security in this country of ours.
Yeah, I mean, Congressman Kinzinger, if you look at what Donald Trump said about that nuclear deal in 2015 and why the U.S. why he wanted out of it and tore it up and walked away from it, to the congressman's point, everything that's on the table now, it's not getting any better from what that deal was.
No, it's clearly not, and they're going to do their best to spin it. And to certain audiences, anything they spin works. But you look at where we are now, right? They went into this initially saying regime change, and then they tried to pretend like having a junior Ayatollah is now regime change. When, by the way, when we actually did a regime change in Iraq, we had to take out Saddam Hussein's sons because we understood you have to clear the regime. So there was no regime change. And then on top of that, the next thing became denuclearization. And right now they're saying Iran will never get a nuclear weapon again. First off, there's nothing in the agreement that says that. There's still the enriched uranium exactly where it has been at the beginning of this. And I'll also say the Iranians have shown their ability to close the strait without significant pushback is basically as powerful as a nuclear weapon. So they have a nuclear weapon in a different name only now, which is why allowing them to then toll like a mafia toll puts us in a far worse situation than, frankly, had we done nothing at all.
Congressman DeLuzio, you're calling on Congress to get answers about that Iranian attack on a U.S. facility in Kuwait that killed 6 American service members in early March. At the time, CNN reported that there were no warnings or sirens, that the building didn't have the kind of fortification to shield it from drones or missiles. CBS just spoke to some of the service members who survived the attack, who reiterated that it was not a fortified position and that it was a known target. Have you seen any appetite among your Republican colleagues on the Armed Services Committee to investigate what happened?
Yeah, and there had been an effort from many of us to push for oversight and an investigation when word first got out of what happened to those Americans. And now with CBS's reporting, talking to some of the service members, I would think my Republican colleagues would wake up and decide this is a time to put our troops and their safety ahead of protecting anyone at the Pentagon. I did see Chairman Crawford of the Intel Committee say something to that effect, that he might be open to this. I think, of course, the Congress has got to look at this. And this goes back to a tradition. I'm thinking of Harry Truman and the Truman Committee of looking at misconduct and war profiteering and more that put our troops at risk. This is the exact kind of oversight we've got to do. It should be bipartisan, but if it's not, after November, Democrats will do this.
Now, since President Trump announced a pause in U.S. strikes in Iran, and 2 days before, the Vice President, J.D. Vance, is expected to lead high-stakes negotiations in Pakistan. The U.S. and Iran, though, still can't agree on what they've agreed to. That translates into this. The Strait of Hormuz remains at a standstill, with 20% of the world's oil stuck in a holding pattern. Shipping companies telling CNN it is simply too risky to send that cargo through. The president venting his frustrations this way. There are reports that Iran is charging fees to tankers going through the Hormuz Strait. They better not be, and if they are, they better stop now. The president following that up with this. Iran is doing a very poor job, dishonorable, some would say, of allowing oil to go through the Strait of Hormuz. That is not the agreement we have. Iran opening the strait, you will recall, was the president's big demand in return for a ceasefire, and that has not happened. And yet you'll notice this, it's important, at least for now, no threats from the president about ending the ceasefire or calling off those planned peace talks. Insight, perhaps, into how much the president wants and perhaps needs these talks to happen to get himself out of a jam. Another complication, Israel launched fresh strikes against Hezbollah targets in Lebanon, and Hezbollah, in turn, fired on Israel. It comes after a massive bombardment by Israel yesterday that the Lebanese health ministry says killed more than 300 people. President Trump telling NBC News today, quote, "I spoke with Bibi, and he's going to low-key it. I just think we have to be sort of a little more low-key." The president then adding he thinks Israel is, quote, scaling back its operation in Lebanon. My Republican source tonight, Congressman Don Bacon of Nebraska. He sits on the House Armed Services Committee. He's also a retired Air Force Brigadier General. Congressman, grateful for your time. You initially said smartly, it's going to take 24, 48 hours to get a sense if this is a real, true ceasefire. We're about 48 hours in. How do you see it?
It seems that the missile firing and combat operations have decreased significantly today. So that would be a good sign for the ceasefire. On the downside, the estimates I'm reading is between 5 to 9% of the normal shipping is going through the Straits of Hormuz. So we're looking at less than 10%. So we need a lot of progress there. But my real concern is we're going to eventually probably have to make peace with a regime in Iran that hates us. Will never make long-term peace with us. They're going to be weakened because we've, decimated their Air Force, their Navy, and many other parts of their military. But in the end, it will be likely that this regime will survive. They'll rebuild with Russia and China's help. And so what I see is we're going to have a short term, maybe 5 years of a weakened Iran, but it will be a threat once again. That's how I foresee it.
Forgive me for interrupting. Help match that up with what we hear from the President of the United States. Just today, he told NBC News he's, quote, very optimistic, a peace deal is within reach. And he calls the Iranians, quote, much more reasonable when dealing with them privately. You seem a lot more skeptical, A, that they can be trusted, and B, if the United States says, as they say, the White House, a complete and total victory, it may be buried, but Iran still has its enriched uranium. As of now, it says it is in charge of the Strait of Hormuz. Where are we?
I don't think it's a total victory. A total victory would be a new regime, a government that represents the people, that wants peace with its neighbors in America, doesn't want a nuclear weapon. I don't think we have that. We have remnants, probably 3 tiers down, I would say, of the IRGC or the Mullah Ayatollah government of Iran. I think the top two layers have been pretty taken out. But you still got the hardcore Shia mindset that's going to govern Iran. That's what way it appears. And that means that though they have no Air Force, no Navy, maybe 5% of their air defenses, I think their nuclear production capability has been badly damaged, but they have spent fuel that they've made previously that can still be used. So there's still a threat, but I think it's quite a diminished threat. But 5 years from now, Russia and China will be working to rebuild this capacity in Iran. And I foresee this, I think short-term good, but a long-term, we still got a problem.
We begin in Israel, where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says his government plans to hold direct talks with Lebanon on disarming Hezbollah. Even so, he is rejecting the idea of a ceasefire.
I want to tell you, there is no ceasefire in Lebanon. We are continuing to strike Hezbollah with force, and we will not stop until we restore your security. Following repeated requests from the Lebanese government to open peace negotiations with us, last night I instructed the cabinet to begin direct negotiations with Lebanon in order to achieve two goals. One, the disarmament of Hezbollah, and the second, a historic, sustainable peace agreement between Israel and Lebanon.
The IDF announced fresh strikes a few hours ago against Hezbollah sites. Earlier, US President Trump said he asked the Israeli leader to be, quote, a little more low-key. The Lebanese Health Ministry now says more than 300 people were killed by Israeli strikes on Wednesday. Iran said that attack violated the ceasefire, though the US and Israel insist Lebanon is not part of that deal. Jeremy Diamond is live in Tel Aviv. Jeremy, talk us through the latest developments.
Well, listen, the Israeli Prime Minister was adamant today that there is no ceasefire in Lebanon, even as he said that he has instructed his government to seek direct negotiations with Lebanon over disarming Hezbollah and establishing, quote, peaceful relations with the Lebanese state. This comes after weeks of entreaties from the Lebanese government to enter into direct negotiations with Israel, but it now comes just a day after Israel carried out the deadliest strikes in Lebanon of this war, killing more than 200 people, according to Lebanese health authorities. And that puts this all in a very different light. The Lebanese government officials are indicating that they will not negotiate under fire, which is exactly what the Israelis want to do. And so a real question now about whether these negotiations actually begin between Israel and Lebanon. We also understand that the Israeli Prime Minister only sought these negotiations with Lebanon at the direct request of President Trump. Sources telling me that yesterday President Trump had a phone call with Prime Minister Netanyahu where he urged him to seek direct negotiations with Lebanon and also to pare down Israeli strikes inside of Lebanon. And while the Israeli Prime Minister said there is no ceasefire in Lebanon, we are told by Israeli sources that Israel is going to scale back some of its strikes in Lebanon. Exactly what that means on the ground, though, is difficult to know. Tonight, we've seen more Israeli strikes in Lebanon, the Israeli military saying that these were aimed at Hezbollah rocket launchers that were preparing to fire at northern and central Israel. We did see Hezbollah rocket fire tonight towards the city of Haifa and other parts of northern Israel as well, as the Israeli military has warned civilians in Israel today to anticipate the possibility of heavy rocket fire from Hezbollah. Nick?
Jeremy Diamond in Tel Aviv, thanks very much. Vice President J.D. Vance is leading a U.S. delegation to Pakistan's capital, Islamabad, for high-stakes negotiations with Iranian officials over the weekend. The American delegation includes President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. A short time ago, President Trump said on social media, there are reports that Iran is charging fees to tankers going through the Hormuz Strait. They better not be, and if they are, they better stop now. Kristen Holmes is live at the White House. What's the latest from there, Kristen?
Well, Nick, we're hearing from the administration officials who really want to make this work. They do not want to upend this very precarious ceasefire deal. And that's why you're seeing President Trump and his administration officials almost working in overtime to try and put this into concrete. So, for example, we heard Vice President J.D. Vance saying that any issue with Lebanon not being or being included in the ceasefire was probably an honest misunderstanding. You also heard the White House really not reacting, other than President Trump's post just moments ago, not really reacting to stories about ships being stuck in the Strait of Hormuz, not really reacting to response from Iranian officials saying that the U.S. had broken the ceasefire for a number of different reasons. You also see that President Trump is making phone calls to the Israeli Prime Minister, essentially telling him that he needs his help to try and make this ceasefire work, asking him to cool it in Lebanon, trying to get anything that they can to make sure that this doesn't fall apart. And we are told that those discussions about the in-person sit-down between the two sides are ongoing, and they feel confident that they're going to happen. But what seems very clear is that if this were to fall apart now, it would be at the behest of the Iranians, not of the United States. We do know the United States had been looking for an off-ramp, and they seem pretty eager to make this that off-ramp.
Kristen Holmes at the White House, thank you very much. Now, for more on all this, we're now joined by CNN military analyst and retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. So we've heard all about the diplomacy right now. Can you give us some sort of picture about what we're actually seeing on the ground right now, militarily and at the Strait?
Yeah, Nick. So basically, militarily, we're kind of in a frozen posture at the moment. So all the U.S. forces are arrayed along the basically the southern periphery of the Persian Gulf. You also have the Marine Expeditionary Units that are just off the coast of the Arabian Peninsula in the Arabian Sea. And then you also have the air assets that are not only on board the carriers, but also the land-based air assets, the Air Force assets in particular.
The breaking news, I quote, "This is not the agreement that we have." That quote is from President Trump, a message to Iran tonight, where he writes, Iran is doing a very poor job, dishonorable, some would say, of allowing oil to go through the Strait of Hormuz. That is not the agreement we have. President puts his names in caps, Donald J. Trump. Now, according to Trump, the ceasefire hinges on Iran reopening the Strait of Hormuz, right? That is the core of it for him. It is the case when you look at the waterway today and the satellite, the truck, the ships moving, traffic is barely moving, and just a handful of ships were reportedly allowed to cross. That includes only 3 oil tankers. There are 500 vessels trapped. The 3 we've been tracking among them, waiting to get through. Iran says, well, you need escorts, and it's complicated because there's mines and all of that, but it's a standstill. The country's lead negotiator is sending Trump a message in the meantime, saying time is running out. He's the Speaker of Iran's parliament, Mr. Khalibaf. He shared part of the 10-point proposal that he says the Trump administration agreed to, which, of course, Trump had referenced. The White House had mentioned a 10-point proposal. It just appears to be that everyone's talking about a different one. The one that Khalibaf is stating says Lebanon is part of the ceasefire. And that's a proposal that the Trump administration says, no, we rejected. Lebanon isn't part of it. Well, Iran says it is, and they say that the dishonor's on the other side. They say time is running out, as we are now just over 24 hours from a series of high-stakes meetings in the actual negotiations themselves. Talks that Trump has said he's optimistic about. Inside Iran, though, they appear more defiant than ever. In his first statement since the ceasefire was announced, the new supreme leader vowing to get revenge after the death of his father. He didn't say this, obviously, in person. We haven't seen him. It was a statement. But he promised to, quote, bring the management of the Strait of Hormuz into a new stage. As we just said, it's pretty clear what that stage is. It's Iranian control, as that strait is essentially shut after Israel's widespread strikes on Lebanon. There were more than 100 of those strikes in 10 minutes yesterday. Reports of more today. And, of course, Iran says those are a violation of the ceasefire. Today, President Trump, meantime, on the phone, desperately trying to save the fragile agreement, calling reporters, including NBC News, where he said, quote, I spoke with Bibi, the Prime Minister of Israel, and he's going to low-key it. I just think we have to be sort of a little more low-key. It is appearing that he's talking about Lebanon, and it is not clear, though, if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is listening to Trump.
אני מבקש לומר לכם,
I want to tell you, there is no ceasefire in Lebanon. We are continuing to strike Hezbollah with force, and we will not stop until we restore your security.
Pretty clear. That's not low-key. That's not trying to be nuanced about it. That's saying this is how I see it, and go and jump off a bridge if you don't like it. That's the tone, but let's see what happens. Jeremy Diamond is out front live in Tel Aviv. So, Jeremy, okay, that's the tone. He's speaking to an Israeli audience there, right? That was not done in English, just to speak directly to Americans, for example. What is the latest you're learning there?
Well, there's no question that the Israeli prime minister is defiant. Tonight, we have seen beyond the rhetoric from the prime minister, Israeli strikes taking place in Lebanon. And moments ago, we saw had air raid sirens go off here in Tel Aviv due to incoming Hezbollah rocket fire. And so it is very clear that while this ceasefire is taking hold in a fragile manner between the United States and Iran, between Israel and Iran, the northern frontier in Israel, between Israel and Hezbollah, has certainly not quieted down at all. And that's despite the fact that we are now seeing the Israeli prime minister saying he's willing to engage in direct negotiations with the Lebanese government to talk about disarming Hezbollah, to talk about establishing peaceful relations with Lebanon, but still that defiance on his right, he believes, to continue striking Hezbollah. And the issue is, whether Israel will actually pare back these strikes in Lebanon is going to determine a lot, because President Trump, we're told, in a phone call with the prime minister yesterday, urged the prime minister to engage in negotiations with Lebanon and also to pare back his strikes against Hezbollah. We're told by sources that that is the plan from the Israeli government, but what that actually looks like on the ground isn't entirely clear, particularly as we're continuing to see this back and forth between Israel and Hezbollah tonight. And it's also not clear that paring back those strikes is going to be enough for the Iranians, who have insisted on a full ceasefire being in effect between Israel and Hezbollah in order to proceed with the broader portion of the ceasefire agreement, in order to open the Strait of Hormuz, which clearly is not opened anywhere close to capacity at this hour. So a lot still hanging in the balance of all of this. And again, we will see how that all impacts the negotiations set to take place tomorrow in Islamabad.
Breaking news, new strikes against a key American ally in the Gulf. Kuwait revealing just now it's been targeted by hostile drones, they say, that targeted vital facilities. Kuwait's National Guard is reporting damage to some buildings. No injuries or casualties, though. Out front now, Jim Bianco, economic analyst and president of Bianco Research. And Jim, I know as you are watching this fragile ceasefire, specifically these strikes on Kuwait are something you're focused on right now. What do you see there?
We're supposed to be a ceasefire, and it's important that we get everybody to stop shooting, especially the Iranians, so that we can give shippers the confidence to start thinking about sending their ships through the Strait of Hormuz and get trade flowing again. If they're going to continue to shoot, no one's going to go anywhere, and we're not making any progress towards opening the Strait of Hormuz.
So Trump today demanded that Iran stop charging tolls for tankers to cross the Strait of Hormuz. Iran had said that they were able to do that, right? So this is part of the whole disagreement. But Trump posted there are reports that Iran is charging fees to tankers going through the strait. They better not be, and if they are, they better stop now. We know that Iran had felt that it could charge, $2 million a ship or something like that, split it with Oman. They had a whole system that they were floating. What does this do to oil prices, which have already now been incredibly elevated for an incredibly long period of time?
Well, first, it sets a horrible precedent, because if we're going to start saying to countries that happen to have a coast near a naturally choke point or a narrow strait anywhere in the world, then all of them can do it. The Strait of Malacca, maybe Tangier could do it with the Strait of Gibraltar. We could go on and on down the maybe the United States could do it, if anybody wants to go past Greenland. The imagination keeps going. So it would be very bad for shipping in the long term. It would be very bad for world trade in the long term. In the immediate, what you're going to find happen is the amount of movement of ships through the Strait of Hormuz is going to be restricted. It's going to be restricted by Iran. It's not just going to be pay your money, you get to go. It's going to be pay your money. What's your cargo? Who is it destined for? We don't like the United States. We don't like Israel. So anything related to them, you can't go through ever. It's going to be all kind of restrictions like that. Restrictions mean less oil. It means higher prices. So it's incumbent for the whole world in the way that shipping works that we maintain what this strait has always been. It's been international waters and it's been free flow of trade without any restrictions.
All right, as part of this, everything that's announced, ceasefire or not, it is always timed around, it feels, the market opening and closing, right? And the president is very cognizant of market opening, closings, and market reaction, right? So there's a method to that. There also, though, has been a lot of suspicious is a very generous word. I'll use it, but it's generous to describe some of these trades. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that newly created accounts on Polymarket placed incredibly large, highly specific bets on the ceasefire. And they did so just hours before Trump publicly announced it. And in those trades, they earned more than $600,000. Now, that's just one. I mean, I can give you hundreds of millions more, okay, if we were to go through this, as you and I both know. But, I guess the question for you, Jim, is how big of a problem is all this? Do you think that there's any chance that anyone ever gets to the bottom of it? And that if there are people who are doing things that, frankly, are against the law, if this is insider trading, that are ever going to be held to account?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's insider trading because prediction markets are not defined for insider trading. It probably falls closer to like Congress trading their own personal accounts. That is also not insider trading either. But the bigger issue is it goes to the integrity and confidence of the markets, and it goes to the integrity and confidence of any administration. Be careful what you wish for. If we're going to continue to see big trades being put in these markets hours before events, someday somebody's going to put in a big trade. And the administration would say, we're not planning on doing anything, but the markets will freak out as if something is happening, and you will have manufactured a crisis out of whole cloth just because we're reacting to prediction markets, not because we're reacting to actual events on the ground. So if this is happening, it's got to stop, because in the long run, you're just not going to like what happens. Sure, you might make $600,000 now, but the damage you will cause in the long term will be orders of magnitude larger than that.
Two strikes by Israel on Lebanon and a flurry of new threats from the president against Iran. Posting on his social network, he says there are reports that Iran is charging fees to tankers going through the Hormuz Strait. They better not be, and if they are, they better stop now. This is the latest threat the president has made. As you know, he's backed off from many of them. His anger over possible fees being charged is interesting, giving an answer to a question he gave just yesterday from ABC's John Karl. Karl asked the president if he was okay with Iran charging a toll on ships, and Mr. Trump told him, quote, "We're thinking of doing it as a joint venture," adding, "It's a beautiful thing." Yesterday's beautiful thing is now apparently not so beautiful. In a follow-up post a few minutes later, the president said, "Very quickly, you'll see oil start flowing with or without the help of Iran, and to me, it makes no difference either way." Unclear how that will be accomplished. He then posted this: "Iran is doing a very poor job, dishonorable, some would say, of allowing oil to go through the Strait of Hormuz. That is not the agreement we have." Now, again, a reminder, we do not know whether that is true because whatever agreement may exist, the public has not been shown it yet. In any case, very little oil is flowing through the strait right now. Just 2 oil and gas tankers have gone through since the ceasefire began, according to one leading maritime data tracking company. About 100 ships a day transited the strait before the war. Right now, more than 400 oil and liquefied gas tankers remain bottled up in the Persian Gulf. Also tonight, Kuwait reporting new incoming drone strikes, though it's unclear from where. And a short time ago, air raid sirens sounded in Tel Aviv, reportedly over an incoming Hezbollah missile from Lebanon. They capped a diminished but still active second day of Israeli strikes in Lebanon, the IDF saying it was targeting Hezbollah facilities, including missile launchers. We also learned that the death toll from the attacks like this one in Beirut yesterday have now topped 300, more than 1,100 wounded. Israel's prime minister today restated his government's view that the truce with Iran does not apply there.
I want to tell you, there is no ceasefire in Lebanon. We are continuing to strike Hezbollah with force, and we will not stop until we restore your security.
The prime minister said he had asked for direct talks with the Lebanese government aimed at disarming Hezbollah. One Lebanese official responded, telling CNN there would be, quote, no negotiations under fire. The president, meantime, confirmed to NBC News today that his phone conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday included a call for restraint. Quoting the president now, he said, quote, I spoke with Bibi and he's going to low-key it. I just think we have to be sort of a little more low-key. He himself was less so in a social media post shortly before midnight last night about what would happen, he says, if Iran does not comply with whatever agreement emerges from the upcoming talks, which get underway on Saturday. Again, quoting the president, then the shooting starts bigger and better and stronger than anyone has ever seen before. In the meantime, he adds, our great military is loading up and resting, looking forward, actually, to its next conquest. Now, conquest in military terms means taking control of land or people through force. That is what the President of the United States now says our military is looking forward to. Just to give you a sense of how far that is from what American presidents have said in the past, I want to play you something that President Franklin D. Roosevelt said on the night of June 6, 1944, which is D-Day. And credit to the Bulwark's Bill Kristol, who wrote about this today. D-Day morning, American Allied forces had landed on beaches in Normandy, a daring, incredible operation that took years of planning. Many Americans had lost their lives that day, but the tide of the war would turn. The president addressed the country on the radio. His statement was in the form of a prayer for the troops going ashore, and he too talked about conquest, or at least he used the word conquest, but not in the way this president did. FDR rejected the notion that American troops were there for conquest.
They will be sore tried by night and by day, without rest, until the victory is won. The darkness will be rent by noise and flame. Men's souls will be shaken with the violences of war. For these men are lately drawn from the ways of peace. They fight not for the lust of conquest. They fight to end conquest. They fight to liberate. They fight to let justice arise and tolerance and goodwill among all thy people. They yearn but for the end of battle, for their return to the haven of home.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt. For more on this, CNN Kristen Holmes joins me now from the White House. Is it clear just how upset President Trump is about the strait and whether the ceasefire, I mean, is it in jeopardy, or what are you hearing at the White House?
Well, we have what President Trump is saying. And honestly, Anderson, these kind of brief phone interviews that he does for 5 minutes with reporters aren't that helpful because he'll often say two different things within 5 minutes of each other. But what we know is happening behind the scenes is that this administration is working desperately to make sure that these talks actually happen on Saturday. They are bending over backwards to lay all the traps to make sure that Vice President J.D. Vance is in Islamabad with Iranian officials. They want this ceasefire to hold. And that even goes to President Trump talking to Bibi Netanyahu and asking him to be more low-key, to have these direct conversations with Lebanon. We know that the back channels are working nonstop. Steve Witkoff is in touch with various countries in the region. They are trying to tone down what's happening in Lebanon. They are trying to work around that issue. And as you saw until President Trump went off on Truth Social, he had also, and the White House, been fairly low-key themselves on calling the Iranians out. And that was intentional. They don't want to get into another skirmish that could potentially end these talks. And from all the sources that we've talked to about this, if someone was to pull out of these negotiations, of these talks on Saturday, at this point, it would still likely be Iran, because the U.S. really wants to make this work. As we know and have been reporting, they are looking for an off-ramp.
The Wall Street Journal has a report out tonight that the White House staff has been ordered to refrain from betting on the Iran war in online prediction markets. The Journal says there's no evidence of wrongdoing. Do you know anything more about that? I mean, why was that directive issued? Do they know that people in the White House have been doing that?
They don't have any actual direct evidence, but there was a flurry of activity about a month ago when President Trump abruptly stopped those strikes in Iran, and essentially a bunch of people were quietly betting on futures. That spiked a lot of awareness and a lot of attention to this. The White House putting out a memo, of course, this is according to the Wall Street Journal, that said that you cannot leverage your position of power and knowledge to bet on any futures markets, and that pertains directly to the Iran war, betting on strikes ending, a ceasefire deal, strikes starting back up again. We have reached out to the White House, of course, for a statement as well.
World lead, a new message from President Trump just moments ago on Truth Social, writing, quote, "There are reports that Iran is charging fees to tankers going through the Hormuz Strait. They better not be, and if they are, they better stop now." President Donald J. Trump. They are, for the record. The 2-week ceasefire deal on the Iran war for now appears to be largely holding. Fewer attacks have been reported across the Middle East today. But one of the main reasons the ceasefire has been described as shaky is Lebanon. On day one of the ceasefire, Israel conducted its biggest wave of strikes on Lebanon since the war began, killing at least 303 people and injuring more than 1,000, according to authorities there. Iran, in response, claimed these attacks were a ceasefire violation and said it closed the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait, of course, is a key sticking point, the U.S. insisting it must remain open for the ceasefire to hold, but the U.S. says Lebanon is not part of the ceasefire deal. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel will start talks with Lebanon focused on disarming Hezbollah, the Iran-backed militia in Lebanon. Today, President Trump told NBC he is, quote, very optimistic a peace deal with Iran is within reach, as a U.S. delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance will head to Pakistan for further talks on Saturday. CNN's Nada Bashir is in Beirut, Lebanon. And Nada, you've witnessed some of these strikes firsthand today. What have you seen?
That's right. We have seen, of course, the continuation of Israeli strikes across Lebanon, particularly, of course, in the south where they are ongoing. What we have heard today in Beirut from the Israeli military is a new evacuation order for a broad area of southern Beirut. This includes areas that have not previously been under evacuation warning. So that has, of course, stoked concern around a possible expansion of the Israeli strikes here in the capital. And, of course, this comes just a day after we saw that large-scale wave of airstrikes across the country, more than 100 targets, according to the Israeli military, who has said that they were targeting Hezbollah command and military targets. But, of course, we were here on the ground in Beirut seeing those strikes firsthand and the impact on the ground, which, it has to be said, were largely targeting civilian areas. We saw on the ground the aftermath of these strikes hitting civilian apartment buildings, residential buildings, local businesses in areas that were extremely populated and busy at the time. And of course, we've been getting updates from local officials and authorities here, the health ministry, saying that the death toll across Lebanon from yesterday's large-scale aerial assault is now over 300, with hundreds more wounded. And of course, the total death toll in Lebanon since the war began, so in just the space of just over a month, is now over 1,800, according to the health ministry. And many here in this country, many of those that we've been speaking to, have been calling for an immediate ceasefire, an end to hostilities. Many here want to see an immediate end to the war. And that is something that the Lebanese government has been pushing for weeks, of course. And it's important to underscore that while we are seeing the continuation of hostilities between Hezbollah, the Iran-backed group in the south, and of course the Israeli military, the Lebanese government itself has been calling for a diplomatic resolution to this latest conflict. In fact, the Lebanese president wrote to the United Nations outlawing Hezbollah's military wing. We know that the Prime Minister has most recently called for its security forces to rid the capital of all non-state arms. The hope for many, of course, is that push for diplomacy will achieve some sort of resolution. But hearing from the Israeli Prime Minister that Lebanon is not part of the ceasefire agreement has certainly raised concern tonight here in Lebanon.
Nada Bashir, critical reporting throughout the course of the day from Lebanon. Thank you very much. Well, also today, House Republicans ignored Democratic efforts to introduce a measure that would rein in President Trump's military powers. Democrats still fuming over Trump's threat earlier this week to take out Iranian civilization.
The
words and actions of this president have proved that he is unhinged and unwell.
Threatening genocide is not a negotiating tactic.
Let's have a vote to end this war, because this ceasefire is a joke. This war should never have happened in the first place, and Congress deserves a say, and the American people deserve a say.
Lebanon health officials say in 38 days of conflict, nearly 1,900 people have died and more than 6,000 have been injured. The World Health Organization now warning that hospitals are running out of supplies and there are shortages of some essential medications.
If the current situation and the current demand actually continue and the current escalation continue, probably the country may be facing a very real risk of critical shortage, including trauma supplies, surgical materials, blood products, chronic medications, and any other further disruption could seriously hinder the ability of providing timely, adequate care for both emergency and ongoing health needs.
The Lebanese Health Ministry says more than 15% of the country's population has been displaced. In response, the charity CARE, which has worked in Lebanon for the last 20 years, has been delivering drinking water, meals and bedding to those without homes. Michelle Nunn is president and CEO of CARE. So, listen, I mean, we can rattle off the numbers, but can you give us any idea what the people of Lebanon and also your staff are dealing with right now?
Yeah, it's an extraordinary crisis, as you just articulated. So, for instance, our CARE team members that are responding to the needs and supplying mattresses, blankets, food, water are also displaced in many instances themselves. As an example, one of the stories that our team shared just this week was of encountering in their distribution a woman who was 4 days from having given birth through a C-section with her baby on the sidewalk. And so that's an example of what the human reality is right now. It is a terrible crisis for over 1 million people that are displaced and for literally everyone who is living in Lebanon who is impacted.
Israel has conducted airstrikes in Lebanon even after the ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran went into effect. Lebanon says that nearly 200 people were killed and hundreds wounded in strikes that hit densely populated areas of Beirut. Israel says the strikes targeted the Iranian-backed militant group, issuing evacuation orders for southern Beirut earlier today. Tanks were seen today on both sides of the border.
The U.S. and Israel insist the truce does not include Lebanon, contradicting Iran and key mediator Pakistan.
Lebanon says at least 10 people were killed today amid a national day of mourning. Let's discuss all of these developments with Nada Bashir joining us live now from Beirut. We've also got Jeremy Diamond for us in Tel Aviv. Nada, let me start with you because we just got word that Benjamin Netanyahu has instructed his cabinet to actually begin live negotiations, or rather currently negotiations, with Lebanon. This is an important development. It's something that the Lebanese have wanted for quite some time. They've, of course, been caught in the middle of this. But the key issue is going to be disarming Hezbollah and how much control Lebanon as a state actually has over Hezbollah in that regard.
That's right. And of course, the Lebanese government has for some time now been pushing for talks and direct negotiations with the Israeli government. That has certainly been the position of the Lebanese president and prime minister. In fact, there have been moves to put pressure on Iran-backed Hezbollah to come to some sort of peace agreement as well to secure Lebanon's borders. Of course, the Lebanese government has previously written to the United Nations in that letter declaring that it has outlawed Hezbollah's military wing and that it is working to disarm the military wing of Hezbollah as a group. But of course, that clearly hasn't been the case, and we've seen further moves by the Lebanese government, as referenced by the Israeli Prime Minister's office with regards to the opening and offer of negotiations. The Lebanese government has essentially called on its security forces to clear the capital, Beirut, of any non-state arms. And this is believed to be heavily focused focused on any Hezbollah actors who are armed and in the city. And of course, there has been mounting concern, mounting pressure across the city, across the country. We've been speaking to people on the ground telling us that they want an immediate and peaceful resolution to the war, that they do not want to see conflict in Lebanon. And we've been feeling the civilian impact of Israel's aerial assault, not only across Lebanon, but here as well in the capital, Beirut. As you mentioned, we saw the largest wave of airstrikes across the country since the war began, and we saw the impact of that here in the capital, where residential buildings, civilian buildings were struck and destroyed. Again, the Israeli military has said that it was targeting what it described as Hezbollah command and military targets, but the civilian impact has been clear. More than 180 people killed, at least nearly 900 people wounded. We've been speaking to families today who are still waiting to identify their dead. So there is a real feeling here of fear over what the next steps will look like, whether perhaps this indication of willingness to take part in talks between Israel and the Lebanese government will mean a ceasefire here in the country. And of course, this comes just hours after the Israeli military issued a new evacuation order for parts of southern Beirut, a broad area of southern Beirut, it has to be said, including areas that have not previously been under evacuation orders. So that has certainly raised concern. Many will be waiting tonight to see whether or not these talks, this offer of negotiations, does mean the beginning of some respite for many families here in Lebanon, or whether perhaps we will continue to see hostilities, and of course how Hezbollah will respond to this.
All right, Nada Bashir in Lebanon for us. Let's go to Jerusalem and Jeremy Diamond. And Jeremy, first question, what caused this sudden decision from Prime Minister Netanyahu to issue these talks now with the Lebanese government? And the argument that we had heard all along for years now from the Israelis was that the Lebanese military either did not have the desire or the ability and capability to disarm Hezbollah. So what could change now?
Well, we're still working to learn details about exactly what led the Israeli Prime Minister to seek these negotiations at this very moment. But obviously, if you look at the context and the timing of this decision, you can start to put some of the pieces together. I mean, we've been talking over the course of the last day or so about the fact that this continued Israeli attacks in Lebanon could potentially put at risk the broader ceasefire between the United States and Iran. We have seen the Iranians repeatedly object to continued Israeli attacks. We have also seen the Pakistanis talk about it. And into all of that comes the Israeli Prime Minister with this promise of negotiations with Lebanon to address the issue of disarming Hezbollah, something that the Lebanese government has been seeking for weeks now, basically since very shortly after Hezbollah began firing rockets on Israel and Israel began retaliating with strikes of its own inside of Lebanon. Now, it's important to note that as of now, we have no indication that these talks also mean that Israel is going to cease fire in Lebanon. In the past, we have seen that Israel typically prefers to negotiate or to force its opponents to negotiate under fire, meaning that it will likely continue to strike even as it negotiates, but we don't yet have a very clear sense of that. We heard the Vice President, J.D. Vance, yesterday talking about Israel potentially scaling back some of its strikes in Lebanon. And so, perhaps that is what we could see from the Israelis here. But as Nada has been reporting on the ground, so far we haven't seen any indications of any kind of changed posture from the Israeli military. Multiple strikes that have taken place today, evacuation orders for the parts of southern Beirut, which typically precede additional Israeli military strikes. So we're just going to have to wait and see. I am, however, learning from an Israeli official that Ambassador Leiter, the Israeli ambassador to Washington, is going to be the official leading the Israeli side of the negotiations. It's also important to note that Israel and Lebanon have held direct talks in the last year. They held them at a relatively lower level in the southern Lebanese city of Nakura in December of 2025. Those were Israel, Lebanon, and the United States were all at that negotiating table. But all of that, of course, fell apart subsequent to the launch of this war in Iran, Hezbollah then entering the fray, and a new explosion of this conflict between Israel and Hezbollah.
All right, Jeremy Diamond in Tel Aviv for us, Nada Bashir. Thank you so much, both of you. I want to bring in CNN Chief International Correspondent Clarissa Ward, who is in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. So, Clarissa, on the one hand, things are quieter today. No missile launches reported from Iran over the last 12 or so hours. But at the same time, things are not status quo as to where they were before the war. I believe with regards to the Strait of Hormuz, only 4 oil vessels were able to pass through or were allowed to pass through yesterday compared to the 100 or so daily before the start of the war. So what are you hearing from sources there on the ground about the state of this fragile ceasefire?
Well, I think there is broad optimism that today has been much quieter than yesterday. Yesterday, there was a feeling of distinct anxiety that was creeping in. Today, for the first time, the UAE reporting not a single attack on its airspace. So this is meaningful progress. But the issue of the Strait of Hormuz is one that is pivotal for the Gulf countries, and the issue of Iran seemingly under the impression that they will continue to implement control of the strait is, simply put, Bianna, a red line for the GCC countries. And what their concern is going forward is regarding these U.S.-Iran direct talks that are expected to get underway in Islamabad on Saturday. They want to be sure that their security concerns and guarantees that address those concerns are baked in to any agreement that comes about as a result of those negotiations. At the same time, they understand what a tall order that may be, given the status quo right now with the U.S. and Iran singing from very, very, very different hymn sheets, and indeed one 10-point plan versus another 10-point plan versus the 15-point plan. And by the way, I should add, the specter or the possibility that these talks could even break apart before they've even started, given that Iran has issued a number of threats saying that if Lebanon is not declared as being part of this ceasefire agreement, that they would not entertain.
Fast approaching ceasefire talks between the U.S. and Iran. The Trump administration is sending Vice President J.D. Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and the president's son-in-law Jared Kushner to Pakistan. Iran's foreign ministry says the talks are contingent on the U.S. adhering to its ceasefire commitments, and among the key issues, the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump says Iran is doing a very poor, dishonorable job of allowing oil to go through the vital waterway. He also warned Tehran against charging tolls to allow ships to pass. Another sticking point is Lebanon. Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says it is not part of the ceasefire, although he wants to begin direct talks aimed at disarming Hezbollah. The Israeli military struck again on Thursday after another evacuation warning. The death toll from Wednesday's massive strikes has now risen to more than 300. President Trump says he asked the Israeli leader to be, quote, more low-key when it comes to Lebanon. Christy Lou Stout following all this. She's live in Hong Kong to start us off. Christy.
Alex, while this very fragile ceasefire appears to be holding, we are hearing from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he says that Israel wants direct talks with Lebanon on disarming Hezbollah, but also adds that Israel will continue to launch strikes against the militant group. Now, we know that Israel, along with the United States, have said that Lebanon is not part of a ceasefire deal, but Iran, as well as Pakistan, which has emerged as a key mediator in this conflict, they are saying otherwise. I want you to listen to what we heard earlier from the Israeli Prime Minister.
Following repeated appeals from the Lebanese government to enter into peace negotiations with us, last night I instructed the cabinet to open direct negotiations with Lebanon in order to achieve two goals. One, the disarmament of Hezbollah. Two, a historic sustainable peace agreement between Israel and Lebanon.
Lebanese officials say that they have not received any formal invitation to these direct talks. And don't forget, on Wednesday, that was when 300 people inside Lebanon were killed by Israeli airstrikes. It's been a few days already since this ceasefire deal was announced. And since then, the missiles are still flying across the Middle East. And ships en masse are not transiting across the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, in the last couple of days, only a handful of vessels have managed to make the crossing through this critical waterway. I want to show you the latest data that we have from Lloyd's List, giving you an indication of how many ships are making this crossing, saying this, quote, just 3 ships over 10,000 DWT, that's deadweight tonnage, that's the total weight capacity of the vessel, transited the strait on Thursday morning with a further 3 Iran-linked vessels, including one sanctioned very large crude carrier tracked transiting the strait on Thursday afternoon. And according to marine traffic, hundreds of vessels remain trapped in the region. And we have a breakdown to share with you on what these vessels are. They include oil tankers. In fact, according to marine traffic, 426 tankers are still stuck in the Gulf, along with 34 liquefied petroleum gas carriers and 19 LNG, or liquefied natural gas ships. And we also have, and this is interesting, fresh comment from the oil chief of Abu Dhabi, who is speaking in very plain terms. He is saying the Strait of Hormuz is, quote, not open. And he goes on to say that access is, quote, restricted, conditioned, and controlled. And shipping execs, they continue to tell me their concerns. They are desperately seeking clarity about the overall security situation across the Strait of Hormuz, as well as the practical matters of what it takes to process a request to transit across the strait, making any crossing right now. And need we remind you or our viewers, Alex, before the war, the Strait of Hormuz was a free and open international waterway. Back to you.
Yeah, and 20% of the world's oil moved through there. So we hear about this big peace talks in Pakistan. How are preparations going? Is that really going to happen?
Preparations are indeed happening. I want to show you this video of the hotel where these high-stakes critical peace talks are due to take place in Islamabad, Pakistan, Saturday morning local time. The hotel is a 5-star hotel. It's called the Serena Hotel, and that is where both delegations from both Iran and the United States will be staying, in addition to having the talks take place there. Of course, the U.S. delegation will be led by the U.S. Vice President, J.D. Vance. Joining him, Special Envoys Jared Kushner, as well as Steve Witkoff. And Pakistani authorities reportedly have locked down a 2-mile perimeter around this hotel. So security is very tight. Security is tight. Stakes are high here, Alex. And of course, what they're trying to achieve here is just monumental. They're trying to achieve peace at a time when this 2-week ceasefire is barely holding. Alex.
Christy Lou Stout starting us off in Hong Kong. Christy, thank you so much. Meanwhile, Democrats in the U.S. House have failed again in their latest effort to rein in President Trump's Iran war powers. Republicans essentially ignored an attempt to introduce the measure during Thursday's pro forma session. Senate Democrats plan to force a vote next week. 3 similar attempts have failed.
I want to tell you, there is no ceasefire in Lebanon. We are continuing to strike Hezbollah with force, and we will not stop until we restore security.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he has instructed his cabinet to begin direct negotiations with Lebanon with the goal of disarming Hezbollah. But the fighting's not stopping. His statement came after the Israeli military launched its biggest wave of strikes against Lebanon since the war started. The Lebanese health ministry says these latest attacks killed more than 300 people and injured more than 1,000.
I was raised in this neighborhood. I did not have time even to call all my friends or family. Some of them were able to leave. Some of them did not have a destination. And the infrastructure, as you know, and the situation is very catastrophic, again, from also a humanitarian angle. So you start to feel like I'm looking for my safety, for the safety of my small family. I'm sorry, but this is getting very emotional.
Wow. Iran is condemning those attacks, saying that discussions aimed at ending the war are contingent on the U.S. adhering to its ceasefire commitments. Tehran says those include a halt to the attacks on Lebanon. The U.S. and Israel insist that was not part of the deal. of government at Claremont McKenna College here in California. He is Lebanese as well. Welcome back to The Story Is. We know so many of your friends and family are there on the ground, and you spend a lot of your time in Lebanon. What are you hearing from them?
Well, Alex, as you can imagine, the situation is very bleak. In the last month, at least 1,800 Lebanese have been killed. 300 Lebanese have been killed in the last 2 days. So as you can imagine, the situation is extremely gloomy. That being said, perhaps, just perhaps, there's a glimmer of hope, because today we heard the news that the Israeli government and the Lebanese government will begin negotiating peace talks under the supervision of the United States.
Fragile ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran, with talks set to begin on Saturday in Pakistan. There is growing concern about whether Iran is actually allowing ships to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Analysts and shipping executives tell CNN it's still too risky, and only a few ships have made the journey in recent days. Tehran has promised to open the vital waterway as part of its deal with the U.S., but President Trump says Iran is doing a very poor, dishonorable job and shouldn't be charging tolls for ships to pass. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Lebanon is not part of the ceasefire agreement, although he wants to begin direct talks aimed at disarming Hezbollah. Israeli military struck Beirut and other parts of Lebanon again on Thursday after another evacuation warning. The death toll from Wednesday's massive strikes has now risen to more than 300. Christy Lou Stout live for us from Hong Kong with the latest. Christy.
Alex, as you've been reporting, this is turning into a key sticking point during this fragile 2-week ceasefire. These comments that we're hearing from the Israeli prime minister saying that Israel wants direct talks with Lebanon on dealing with Hezbollah as it continues to target the militant group in Lebanon. You have Israel and the United States saying, nope, Lebanon is not part of the ceasefire deal, while Iran, along with the mediator Pakistan, are saying otherwise. Let's listen to exactly what the Israeli leader said earlier.
Last night, I instructed the cabinet to open direct negotiations with Lebanon in order to achieve 2 goals. 1, the disarmament of Hezbollah. 2, a historic, sustainable peace agreement between Israel and Lebanon.
That Lebanese officials say they have yet to receive any formal invitation from Israel in regards to these direct talks. On Wednesday, that was when 300 people inside Lebanon were killed by Israeli attacks. Look, since this ceasefire was announced a couple of days ago, lives have been taken, missiles continue to fly across the Middle East, and ships and vessels are finding it extremely difficult to make that crossing through the vital waterway known as the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, only a handful of ships have actually managed to cross the strait, and we're getting some very interesting granular detail from Lloyd's List about how many ships and what kind of ships are making it through. This is what they posted on X.com earlier, saying this: just 3 ships, over 10,000 DWT, that refers to the total weight capacity of the vessel, transited the Strait of Hormuz on Thursday morning, with a further 3 Iran-linked vessels, including one sanctioned very large crude carrier, tracked transiting the strait on Thursday afternoon, unquote. And marine traffic is giving us more details on the types of vessels that remain stuck in the Gulf because of this ongoing selective blockade by Iran of the Strait of Hormuz. These include 426 tankers. They include 34 LPG carriers, as well as 19 LNG ships. We're hearing very interesting and telling comments from the oil chief of Abu Dhabi, who says very straightly the Strait of Hormuz is, quote, not open. He goes on to say that it is restricted, conditioned, and controlled. And Alex, we also learned that South Korea is now sending a special envoy to Iran in order to broker some sort of a deal to release their vessels, their ships that remain stuck at the Strait of Hormuz. Back to you, Alex.
What a mess. Christy Lou Stout in Hong Kong, thank you so much. To Israel now, Palestinian officials are calling on the international community to step in after Israel secretly legalized the establishment of more than 30 new Jewish settler outposts in the West Bank. Sources say the decision was made last month and kept quiet to avoid triggering international criticism. Settler violence towards Palestinians in the West Bank has been surging since the start of the Iran war. Outposts are illegal under both Israel and international law. But the Netanyahu government has been pushing to expand settlements in what some see as an effort to destroy the possibility of a future Palestinian state. Russia has announced a ceasefire in its war against Ukraine for the Orthodox Easter holiday. A statement from the Kremlin on Thursday said that President Vladimir Putin will, quote, proceed from the assumption that the Ukrainian side will follow the example of the Russian Federation. It will start Saturday afternoon and will expire at the end of the day on Sunday. For its part, Ukraine's President Zelensky has previously said that he forwarded the offer of an Easter ceasefire to Russia through U.S. negotiators. Pushing, shoving, chaos erupted during a march by workers in Venezuela who were protesting pay wages, which have not increased since 2022. Union members, workers, and students clashed with police holding shields as they approached the government palace in downtown Caracas on Thursday. It comes one day after Venezuela's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, announced what she called a responsible increase of the minimum monthly wage. But she didn't specify the amount, which is supposed to start May 1st.
New tonight, Tomahawks under pressure. The United States reportedly firing at least 850 Tomahawks in the Iran war so far, nearly 9 times the number the military is expected to receive the entire fiscal year, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's a serious problem that threatens American security, and the Trump administration is trying to find another way to produce long-range cruise missiles. Alex Michelson is out front.
We would call this really the world's first low-cost cruise missile.
They are designing and 3D printing future weapons of war at Divergent Technologies.
Is this the first cruise missile that was entirely 3D printed?
Yes.
And that's not being done by anybody else?
No.
This cruise missile made 10 times cheaper than previous models and designed and built in weeks instead of years.
We engineer, manufacture our own printer.
CEO Lucas Zinger gives us an exclusive tour of company headquarters in Torrance, California, where U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth recently visited.
What was his big takeaway from this?
His takeaway was we need more